the Chinese New Year Parade. These days, the parade represents one of the few times the streets of Chinatown are as vibrant as they were in the past. Today's Chinatown lacks the spirit and sense of community of years past. Many of its beautiful, historic buildings are becoming more and more dilapidated as a result of lack of upkeep and decades of use. Many Chinese have continued to physically and emotionally detach themselves from their ancestral beginnings in this iconic Vancouver neighborhood. The Meiwa Hotel building at 258 East Pender Street was around when the exact opposite was true. Vancouver's Chinatown shares its beginnings with the founding of the city itself. A small lumber mill town until the completion of the Transcontinental Railway, which utilized the labor of some 17,000 Chinese, Vancouver grew rapidly in the late 19th century. With the railroad complete and Chinese immigration continuing, despite the passing of the racially motivated head tax in 1885, the demand for rooming houses soared. Many of the young men who made up the Chinese labor force continued to work in industries such as fishing and logging, in addition to clearing the land. The Meiwa Hotel, built in 1913 and originally called the Loyal Hotel, was the largest rooming house in Chinatown. Rooming houses such as these, which were located in the heart of the Chinese community, provided affordable accommodation to workers in a place where they could shop, socialize, send money back to China, and rest. Significantly, spaces like these also both provided and created a sense of security and social support. They were a home away from home for the countless Chinese workers who, over the past 100 years, helped to build British Columbia into what we see today. While the living spaces were cramped and sometimes below city standards, this proximity undoubtedly played a role in community building. The sounds and smells of dinner cooking in one of the communal kitchens, perhaps a lineup for the washroom. Much is owed to the Chinese pioneers who overcame prejudice, poverty, and squalor to carve out their own small niche. Just down the street from the Loyal Hotel was the Yue Shan Company building, which had been built by one such pioneer, a man named Yip Sang. One of the oldest buildings in Vancouver and the oldest in Chinatown today, the Yue Shan Company building was built over 100 years ago in 1889. The building went through several upgrades and additions over the next 23 years, reflecting the expansion of commerce and wealth for elite Chinese merchants. Yip Sang had 4 wives and 23 children, his family growing as rapidly as his business at the turn of the century. He was an example of the first generation of Chinatown merchant elites. Without significant wealth or education, men like Yip Sang nevertheless amassed considerable fortunes. In addition to constructing buildings and employing Chinese workers, these men became leaders in the community, helping to establish social service organizations such as the Chinese Benevolent Association. Throughout the beginning of the 20th century, the Chinese community in Vancouver continued to grow, despite a now extraordinarily costly head tax of $500. Between 1911 and 1923, Vancouver's Chinese population grew to 6,500. Chinatown was now firmly established, many of its buildings and stores now being made of brick. One such store may have been the one owned by Louie, best known for being the patriarch of one of Chinatown's most prominent families. The small grocery store he opened in 1903 would ultimately symbolize Chinatown's broad influence throughout BC. Louie furthered connections between Chinatown, Vancouver, and all of British Columbia because Louie owned many of the trucks used to transport the produce. Lines can be traced from small towns all over the province to Chinatown, reinforcing the notion that Chinatown is connected to all of British Columbia. As Chinatown prospered, BC prospered. However, in 1923, due to mounting racism against the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in order to stop all Chinese immigration. Until the act was repealed, 24 years later in 1947, officially, only 44 Chinese came to Canada. During those years, Canada Day was known to the Chinese as Humiliation Day, Nevertheless, the Chinese community bonded through activities like sports. The Chinese student soccer team won the Iroquois Cup in 1926, the Wednesday League Cup in 1931, the Spalding Cup in 1937, and the BC Mainland Cup in 1934. This was a source of great pride for the community. After the BC Mainland Cup Championship, celebrations broke out throughout Chinatown. A parade, complete with a hired band, marched through the small but jubilant Vancouver neighborhood. Much more than just a trophy, the success of the Chinese students' soccer team showed that unlike the racist situations of daily life, in athletics, everyday Chinese could fight and win.
Look at the faces on the sports teams, and you see the sense of pride, you see the sense of community.
It's strange. I mean, in spite of all the discrimination and the problem, you look back in the old pictures. There's such a sense of optimism, and hope in those days, and the future seemed to look so bright.
Fittingly, the day after the monumental victory was declared a holiday in Chinatown. This sense of togetherness was also reflected in the many associations and societies scattered throughout Chinatown, many of which owned their own buildings. The Yue Shan Society buildings have long been a part of Vancouver's landscape. Today, as in the past, just up the stairs and behind an old white door, the clack-clack of the mahjong tiles being shuffled signaled the coming together of people. After the 1940s, in an effort to attract more young people in the community, the building became a place for people to learn dance, martial arts, and play music. Downstairs, the sounds and smells of the dry goods stores, barbershops, herbal stores, and drugstores merged with the vibrant community spirit above. If you wanted a haircut in the 1920s, you could stop by the Tai Hong barbershop. In the 1940s or 50s, you could drop by the Wing Hing dry goods store for some dried scallops and ginseng. And in 1975, you could visit the China West novelty shop for some toys and Chinese curios. Anyone and everyone could take part in this community. In between the bustling of the society spaces and the shops below, the building's rooming apartments tell many stories. As with the Loyal Hotel, bachelor men would come from all over British Columbia. Even today, people still rent out these rooms. But they aren't just bachelor men anymore. People from all ethnicities and walks of life are now part of the community, created within the space of the Yue Shan building and countless others like it. Chinatown associations and societies like these would also engage in grassroots community work and philanthropy. The principle of helping and supporting one another has a long history in Chinatown. Individuals would also be active in such activities. People like Bick Lee.
He was very generous to the public, and he contributed significant pieces of property for community purposes, like fairly large lots that he donated to the Chinese public school.
Many other individuals and organizations also participated in similar activities, and to this day, Chinatown remains a hub for social services and charitable groups. In addition to being a place for the exchanging of people's ideas, services, and abilities, Chinatown became a site for the whole of Vancouver to congregate and stand up for their city. In 1957, the city of Vancouver announced plans to demolish large parts of Chinatown and Strathcona, in a plan they called urban renewal. With the demolition of the surrounding areas having already commenced, the Strathcona Property Owners and Tenants Association was formed in order to stop the city's plans. Support was garnered as a result of the efforts of people like Mary Lee Chan, who canvassed door to door and helped to organize fundraising banquets. However, this was not enough. In the summer of 1967, the efforts intensified and much of Vancouver banded together against the proposed demolition. In 1968, the city cancelled its plans. People from very different backgrounds all came together to help save a vital Vancouver community. Chinatown was more than just an ethnic enclave, and in 1971 was designated a historical district. As the people of Vancouver were working together to save Chinatown, The 1960s and 1970s heralded a change in Chinatown's demographics and population. Chinese Canadians were moving out of the neighborhood. The Chinese were becoming more and more integrated into the rest of Vancouver. Places like Victoria Street and 41st Avenue, as well as the city of Richmond, became new focal points for Chinese Canadians. As a result, Chinatown has become a less vibrant and cohesive community. In many ways, it has become a place neglected. Over the past 100 years, Vancouver's Chinatown has gone from several wooden shacks in a row to one of the most historically important districts in the city. Its tumultuous past has produced a diverse and vibrant community. In the face of extreme racism and prejudice, the Chinese community banded together to write a history all British Columbians can be proud of today. From no more than 15 humble and often defamed city blocks in Vancouver's East End came some of British Columbia and Canada's most celebrated citizens. The first Chinese Canadian doctor, lawyer, member of parliament, and broadcaster, several university chancellors and Order of Canada recipients, as well as numerous philanthropists and successful businesspeople. But surrounding these important figures is the community from which they and their ancestors came. The buildings which they lived, the streets which they walked, the subtle sights and sounds which made up everyday life in Chinatown over the past 100 years. 51 East Pender, 531 Carroll, 258 East Pender, 8 West Pender. Buildings such as these tell of a heritage that today can be traced to and from Chinatown, a heritage which touches British Columbians from every background all over the province. What tales will they tell in the future?
Those are the things that he taught us, to be fair and to be generous. So we sort of ingrained in our minds that, and help the community. If you're successful, help the community. And I think we're all trying to do that as children. Yeah.